My name is Michael. I'm the CFO of a company called Brex. We are a corporate credit card for technology companies. This slide's slightly outdated. Last week, we also announced a cash management account, so I guess we're a financial company for technology companies. That's not the theme of tonight, but just to give you a quick overview of what we do, which will hopefully add some credibility to why I'm talking to you about finance. I'm the CFO of a fintech company. Typically, fintech companies have more robust needs for finance teams. I was actually the first hire at Brex. There's another person who does talks like this who says she was the first hire. I was the first person on payroll at Brex. We are a Brazilian, the founders of Brex are two Brazilian entrepreneurs, and they hired a third Brazilian person who was not necessarily visa approved, was not on payroll, so I'm the first payrolled employee at Brex. What we do, so we do financial services for early stage companies, starting with a corporate credit card. We announced that back in 2018. Then, as I mentioned, we announced a corporate cash management account, which offers 1.6% on your cash. So it's pretty nice to pay for everything in one seamless login. So you should check it out. About myself, I went to Columbia in New York City. I worked at JP Morgan right out of school. I worked in financials investment banking, so that means I worked on like bank M&A. And then I worked at a private equity company here. And then I worked at a company called SoFi, which you all might be familiar with. I started pretty junior as like a manager in the capital markets group, and I kind of worked or bulldozed my way up to, I became the Director of Finance, VP of Finance. I ran the mortgage business. I became the Chief Revenue Officer. Then I met Enrique, who is the CEO and founder of Brex. He talked to me about what he wanted to do in corporate cards. I had been the decision maker at Brex, at SoFi. I decided who got credit cards and who didn't, and everybody complained. And so I thought, wow, this could be a good opportunity. I really understood the need, and I left to join Brex. So that's my story. And now, after that commercial, I'll talk to you about some startup financial advice. So just to go through and it sounds like from the intro that Elsa gave, which was very helpful, that a lot of you're all at different stages. So I'll try to tailor this to broad startups, which is an area I think I have some expertise in. I think normally, when you're thinking about the financial anatomy of a startup, what are we talking about? Typically, there's one person in a startup at its early stage that deals with finance. That's usually an operational founder. You may be a solo founder, then you have to do that. You may have a bigger team, but there's someone who sort of handles ops. It's not usually like a finance specialist. And then often that person also has an outsourced accountant. So those are kind of the team. Most people use QuickBooks Online. So I think one of the themes I'm going to say is you're all starting startups presumably because you want them to work. So you should plan on them being successful. It doesn't mean get crazy and have the best finances ever, but it does mean that as you start to think through what your systems and processes, approach your company like it's going to be successful, and in the future, like someone is going to want to take a look at what you've done, understand your financials, and so you should plan to win, which means set things up right. So typically people are using an online accounting software. Most people use QuickBooks. I would recommend it. Carta is something that I like to talk about. That's for your cap table management. In general, setting up your cap table, meaning kind of the equity ownership of your company early correctly is helpful. For banking, a lot of people use First Republic. A lot of people use Silicon Valley Bank. We now have Brex Cash. Payroll and benefits, a lot of times, typically like to say people use payroll and they pay it biweekly. I would just start doing it biweekly because you may start monthly, you may start semi-monthly and think that that's going to work. And it's ultimately the whole world does biweekly. That's people's expectations. So just start there. Health benefits, people offer them. So when I started, because I was working for two Brazilians that aren't familiar with the U.S. healthcare system, they were like, oh, well, we don't have healthcare. And I was like, well, here's the thing, we need that. So I set it up. But in general, if you're going to hire someone, it's fine as a founder, maybe you're not going to have it, but you really can't hire anybody. They're going to expect that. 401k, again, you don't need that. A lot of people offer it. It's a competitive environment, so I just like to mention that. Most people for payroll in the startup space use Gusto or Rippling. I've used both. We started on Gusto, switched to Rippling. Secondly, I'd like to add payment approvals. Good early process in a startup. You always want to have an email chain before money goes out the door. So money out the door is kind of a big deal, and so people don't realize that. So typically, you kind of only have one person in a startup, or a few people, the two founders, maybe the operational person we talked about, that can actually access the bank account and send money, and people don't get to just do that because that's an area for fraud or problems. And so typically, at least in the beginning, have an email approval saying, confirming, sending this out, approved, right? Just some good framework. I'll get into more details, but I just wanted to kind of start here. In terms of processes, I would say it's really good to have a monthly close process. What does that actually mean in a startup? It just means at a minimum, at the end of each month, take a look through your bank statement, take a look through all of the financials, like activity that you've had, and try and, if you're not, if you have an outsourced accountant, they'll obviously work with you on this, but at a minimum, just review what's happened for the month. Ideally, and I'm going to get a lot more into details, you'd do an actuals versus budget. So you'd sort of have an expectation of how things would go, and you'd compare how things went. That would be super helpful. Over time, as you add boards, typically you're going to have a quarterly board of directors meeting. That in the earliest stage that won't matter, but later it does. And as soon as you have outside investors, they're going to expect that. And so there's that's another time where people typically review financials. As you grow, you'll also need an annual audit. That means you hire another third-party person. Typically costs somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000 for a small company. So it's not cheap, but it's not the most expensive thing you're going to do. I can't tell you what our monthly AWS bill is, but it's a lot higher than that. But that's as you get bigger. But the point is that it's money well spent, and that's a third-party person looking at your financials and signing off on them. For payments, people often use a credit card. To buy software today online, you need a credit card. That was why we created the product Brex in the marketplace. And then for T&E, for travel and entertainment payments, some people use corporate cards. Some people use just personal reimbursement. Either way, I'll go through some more softwares that people use. But I just like to highlight from a financial perspective, there always going to be stuff you're fine to reimburse, but ultimately, as you start to buy ads, things like AWS, you're not usually going to want to put that on your personal credit card. Okay. So monitoring spend. I think that I just mentioned, but budgeting, forecasting helps do this. It's a natural way to raise the conversation. What I mean by that is if you set up a budget ahead of time, and I'm going to go through more details of how you do that, it's really not awkward to have the conversation at the end of the month. Are we spending what we thought we did? Are we meeting the goals we set out? Whether it's revenue, spend, whatever. I think that because you have this process, you kind of get over the awkwardness of the conversation because you kind of have it set up that each month you're going to have this conversation, because co-founders need monitoring too. Right? You may not be totally aligned with how you spend money across everyone in your company, but if you set up a monthly process where you review your financials, that's a natural way to bring up the conversation. The other thing is when you start to, and I'm going to talk to more details about cash burn and how we calculate that, but you should look at how much of cash burn you have monthly, right? And one of the ways to do that is by looking at your financial statements each month. When you look at that, or even just your bank statements, and you see how much money you've burned through, I'm assuming you all are burning money versus generating money. But if you're generating money, you're doing better than me, so you probably don't need this conversation. But if you look through the burn, and you want to always kind of have 6 months, I think, of runway if possible. Look, that's not always the case, but especially if you're hiring other people that are dependent on your company for their livelihood, I think that tends to be a benchmark that I would follow. And so that's the buffer that I would suggest. And then when to hire a CFO or outside help, I get this question asked a lot before I get into all the details. Maybe after this conversation you think like, okay, I really do need to hire a CFO or outside help because I don't know what Michael's talking about. But here are the things that I think must happen if your company is going to be successful. Someone must maintain accurate books and records. That doesn't have to be you. It could be an outsourced accountant. It can be you. Some people, like I'm actually both my parents are CPAs. But I am self-taught from accounting. It's not, both of the founders that I work with knew accounting. So they taught themselves, they didn't even graduate from high school. So a lot of you do things that are much more complicated than accounting. So it's up to you how you want to spend your time. But I assume many of you are capable of teaching yourself or you already know. But that's sort of a decision about how you want to spend your time, but someone must do it. It's critical to fundraising. If you don't address it, things can get out of control. And as I already mentioned, you started your company with the assumption that it's going to work. So you should assume that someone's ultimately going to want to see your financials because you're going to be a successful business. And that's part of being a successful business is people, customers, investors, regulators, auditors, all ask to see this information. At the earliest stage, unless you have this expertise, my advice is to just outsource it. There's tons of accounting firms. They're not that expensive. Brex has a whole portal, which is that screenshot I showed there, that actually helps you find an accountant. So if you just go to brex.com, you can find that. And we have a lot of articles about all this stuff. CFOs, I said I think they're relevant for fintech early. A lot of times for fintech companies, you have capital needs, you have funding needs. It's a more complicated financial operation. But outside of that, my opinion is it probably doesn't make sense to bring in a CFO until around a Series B. So it's not something I would spend a lot of time on in the early stage. I'd wait till you have, said differently, once you have product market fit, probably the time to bring in a CFO. Until then, or maybe even after that, I probably wouldn't focus on that. And then just some tools that people use. I already mentioned a few of these. Expense management. This is seeming more promotional Brex than I meant it to be, so apologies. Expense management. A lot of people use Expensify for personal reimbursements. On the forecasting side, Google Sheets and Excel is really all you need. You need PDFs. You never send investors anything that's not a PDF because it's just kind of sloppy. It's just a little bit of a tip if you don't know that. And then I put DocSend there. I don't know if you guys know that tool, but some people are really sensitive to who's reading their stuff. I'm a little bit like that. So DocSend is a pretty cheap tool that lets you control who actually sees your email, and they only can click the link, so you're not ever sending a presentation. So any other person that views it, you can see if they forwarded it. Doesn't prevent someone from screenshotting every single page of your deck and then making their own PDF and sending it, but that's a lot of work, so at least if you want to have someone trying to copy you, they have to make more effort than most. Okay, so now I'll get into more financing for startups. Basically, cash burn and cash flow is your change in cash over a period of time. In my opinion, for most of you outside of fintech, all you would really want to do is exclude investment. So don't think like, oh, we're not burning any cash because investors sent us all this money this month. Like, no, right? That's obviously, so that you would call that cash from financing. Cash from investing, and I'm getting into accounting, means purchase, typically for most contexts in the world we live in, is purchase of CapEx, buying computers. In my opinion, buying computers is relevant. As you hire people or as you do your job, you need to buy computers. So what I would basically say is just exclude money that comes in from financing, and any change in cash that you see in that period is your burn. So the point is, it's not exactly your income statement or your balance sheet. If you guys know financials, it's the interaction of those two. Because accounting, the way it works is it's on an accrual basis, meaning a good example of that is if you, in accounting, you may have received cash for a software product, but someone may pay upfront for a month of SaaS. But if you actually deliver the SaaS over the entire month, you wouldn't necessarily recognize the revenue all up front, but you get the cash all up front. I wouldn't really worry about that in the earliest stages. That's something for the outsourced accountant to worry about. But the point is that your income statement might not, which is what I just talked about, the way you recognize revenue, isn't always going to match the cash burn, but cash is king in the beginning of a startup. When I worked at SoFi, before I started in finance, it was so bad, things were so bad, like we had such poor records that the CFO used to say, like, I don't even want to know what the accounting team has prepared. I just want to see the bank statement. Like, I don't care what you guys say, just let me see how much cash we have. So like at the end of the day, using your bank and seeing how your balances change over months outside of financing is going to be a pretty good way to track how much you're burning. Of course, as I mentioned, subscription businesses, things that are prepaid, right? Think about airlines. They get lots of money up front for that. You buy your ticket way in advance, the service hasn't been delivered. So there's going to be nuances, and software has that nuance. A lot of you are probably software. So when you're charging monthly, there is this concept of deferred revenue, which is, you get paid before the entire service is delivered. That's really a recognition point. One thing that I thought would be helpful that I put here, that's, I don't know if it's clear, but at Brex, we take a lot of our data, anonymize it, and aggregate it, and try to give you a sense for, by type of business, what is the typical burn rate, and also what is the typical burn rate by geography. So there's lots of data on Brex. If you're kind of wondering, are we spending too little, too much? We have a bunch of stuff like that, which might be helpful. Okay. So fundraising, do you need to? So this comes back to the burn in the 6 months, right? So you're looking at your burn. We just talked about how you calculate it. That was the most crude way. The most crude way is, how did my bank balance change month over month? We'll get into more detailed ways to do that. But the question is, once you're looking at 6 months or less of burn, that's probably when you need to fundraise. But when you're fundraising, the other thing that you need to think through is, what are the major milestones that you're fundraising off of? Typically, especially in the early stage, it's like, I've completed my MVP, right? I have 10 customers. There's some milestone that you think, or I have a proof of concept, or I have an idea, or we need a big hire. Whatever it is, you need to think through over the next period of time, call it 18 months, what are the milestones you need to hit? And come to an agreement with your leadership team, and then factor in how much you're burning and figure out, okay, well, when should we fundraise, right? And then that also relates, and we'll get into this, how much, because you're trying to think through, okay, for example, with Brex, right? We wanted to launch, and we wanted to launch our product. We launched it out of stealth, and we wanted to get to launch and have self-sign up. So we kind of knew how long, from a technical perspective, it was going to take to have that product. And then we thought we would need some momentum for launch to fundraise. So when we were raising the round prior to launch, called the seed, we thought through how much money we would need to get there. So I hope that's making sense, because that's not something, nobody really teaches you that, but I think it's helpful. And then you also need to forecast your business, which I'll get into, because as you grow, mainly meaning as you hire people, as you do that, you will have changing cash needs, and you need to consider that as well. So a couple KPIs for startups and why they matter. So KPIs are metrics. They're usually forms of division that indicate business performance and drive decisions. And the point of these is not that you want to be like running around like a McKinsey consultant with all these KPIs when your business is super small. That's stupid. But what you do want to do is have a sense for how investors are going to benchmark your business relative to others. And so I think that's something that's not always clear to early stage founders about finance that's really important, which is, if you have a software business and it kind of looks like Twilio, or it has some things that could be like Twilio, you should look at Twilio's financials and try to understand, well, what do they charge? How big of a market share do they have, right? Because you're trying to understand, how does your business compare? If you're saying you're going to build a competitor to WeWork, and your margins are way different than WeWork's margins, which don't seem to be that good, like, you need to you need to consider all of these things, right? Or you say you're going to grow to be, say you're serving, I don't know, you're serving SMBs, right? And you look at a company like Intuit, QuickBooks, which serves SMBs, and you're saying you're going to get to a certain number of customers. Well, what market share do they have? And how quickly are you trying to get there? So luckily, all that information is, all these companies that are publicly traded, or companies like WeWork that have ever filed to go public but didn't go, they provide tons of data to the market about what exists. So I think you must consider at least what other public companies, whether it's the same market, same business model, same approach, are kind of doing what you do, even if they're legacy, just to understand how you will be compared across other businesses. Even if it's as simple as, well, a bunch of cool companies this year, like Zoom, that serve businesses, went public. I wonder how fast they grew. You could look historically to see how fast was their growth. So, it's, at a minimum, you should do this. So a couple things that people would look at that are relevant, that are not dopey, are churn and retention. So like example, we were always, at Brex, we were trying to figure out, we serve e-commerce businesses as well. We were trying to look at churn. So there's not that much in the market available for churn. So we said, okay, could we look at Peloton? They just filed to go public, the bike company, right? So what's the churn at Peloton? Even though that's totally irrelevant to what we're trying to do, it's really a metric of the churn that e-commerce businesses themselves might see, right? Same with Spotify. What's their churn? So at least you're starting with something versus completely nothing. Same-store sales and existing growth. So same-store sales is a retail concept, right? But it's often applied to mean same customer sales. So for example, if Twilio as a company I just mentioned, you're probably mostly familiar with that company. One of the reasons why people really like that business is because people that use Twilio use more of it each month because they serve businesses like Uber, et cetera, that are themselves growing and they're needing more of Twilio. So anyway, cross-sell. That's if you're a kind of business that has multiple products, how much are they sold between the products? Funnel metrics. So if you're a traditional self-sign-up product, whether you're software or consumer, how many people are visiting your website? How many of those people are turning into sign-ups or marketing qualified leads? How many of those people are choosing to take a demo from sales if you're traditional SaaS? That's a sales qualified lead. What's the conversion? So this will apply to some people, it won't apply to others. Profitability metrics. These are standard. People want to see these. Again, before you even have a product, so obviously this is something to consider, but how often, because if you notice, all these things I'm talking about, these translate across businesses, right? Someone can look at the Brex conversion funnel and make a question, and they can say, well, they have this many website visitors, and it converts to this way, and that is actually, you can compare that to Slack. In some ways, right? We're both B2B. So it's relevant if you're an investor in Slack to kind of know, well, what is Brex's metrics? So marketing payback months, that's another thing. So that payback month, that concept is this idea of how much are we spending on customer acquisition and how does the gross margin, which I'll get into, how quickly does that pay for itself based on the product? Lifetime value. What is the total revenue of the customer over its life with us? For some people that are purely transactional, for example, SoFi, we're refinancing people's student loans, that happens once and then you're done, right? So maybe we sell that person another product in the future, but there's no real concept of an LTV, right? Whereas you have a product where you're selling a software subscription to a business, to a person, then how long is that person likely to stay with you? That's the lifetime value, that amount of months times the monthly revenue that you get. Customer acquisition costs I talked about. Gross profit per customer I'll get more into, but gross profit just means the actual costs associated with serving that customer only, right? So in software, gross profit is almost 100%. Right? Oftentimes, if you've already developed the software, the cost to serve an incremental customer is zero. So it's almost 100% gross margin product, as you know, which is why people love software. Okay, headcount metrics. it's good to look at, revenue per employee, sort of relevant, but that's as you get bigger. Average comp is relevant. Remember, compensation is your biggest expense. And then some people, if you're a customer service heavy organization, how your customer service management is performing could be really relevant, right? How quickly are you getting back to customers? Are they satisfied? That it depends on what you're doing. Okay, so projections. So we've talked about KPIs, we've talked about burn, we've talked about fundraising. Now with projections, we're talking about what are the resources needed to hit those milestones by department. So what you typically want to do is look at the major spend buckets that you have. So the biggest one, as I've mentioned a couple times, is staffing and headcount. One thing that people often do is they forget to include contractors. Contractors also cost money. So just because they're not on your payroll doesn't mean you don't have to pay them. So that's a point. The next biggest area of spend for early stage companies is professional services. Legal fees, consultants, those kind of people and offerings will eat up a lot of your budget. The next is facilities, although for those of you that are here, I think it sounds like this is free. So that sounds good. But facilities typically be the third biggest expense. I've written a bunch of stuff on the Brex blog about how you can track all these things, facilities expense, how do you get your first office, what it should cost, et cetera, should you choose to leave this warm bubble. And then on the marketing side, that marketing tends to be once you have, a business that's moving. It depends on what you're doing, right? But marketing for some businesses is zero. For many businesses, in the e-commerce space, it's a huge expense. So it's just a matter of your business. But those are typically, one thing that's interesting and that I want to point out here is for early stage businesses, and this is why the world that we all live in is different than most companies, none of this has to do with revenue. Forecasting revenue is not that relevant in the early stage, right? We're trying to just understand what is the cash burn. These are what's generating the cash burn. This is what's your life or death in the beginning, right? Revenue is a nice to have. If you've already got tons of revenue coming in, and then you probably wouldn't be here. So the point is that it's most of the things that you're trying to estimate, those things are actually knowable. Because a lot of these expenses are planned, right? You know what you're paying someone. You roughly should know how many people you're going to hire and roughly what you're going to pay them. It's not that hard. So you actually can do more of this forecasting than you might think. Then you get into revenue. You may not even have revenue. But the point I would like to mention, and this is the gross profit and margin discussion I was talking about, you should understand if your business is successful, how will you price it? What will drive the revenue? There's two components to revenue, price and volume, right? Units and what you're selling them for, whether it's subscriptions, whether it's rides, whether it's credit card transactions, whatever it is. There's two components to revenue, and so you should have a sense. So price is typically easier to forecast. You probably know what you're going to charge. Volume is what you're estimating. One thing to mention is in some businesses, gross versus net revenue is a big deal, especially in healthcare. So oftentimes you may be offering something that, and I guess an easy example, I've already used Uber, so I'll stick with it. There's sort of the gross revenue that they earn on that you pay for the ride, but a huge portion of that goes back to the driver. So without getting into accounting for that, you obviously want to think through the drivers of your revenue and how much is paid out with the immediately associated costs. I mentioned in software you have very little. In something like Uber, you would have a lot of what you would call COGS, cost of goods sold. So revenue less COGS equals gross profit. So to use a more simple example in manufacturing, if you're making cars, there's what you sell the car for, and then what it costs to build the car. The net of that would be your gross profit. So the directly attributable cost to delivering that good or service which goes into gross profit. So if you're a staffing company, whatever, if you're a law firm, whatever you're billing is your revenue, whatever you're paying the lawyer to work on that is your COGS, and the net of that is gross margin. So the thing is, it's just helpful to understand what kind of business you're building and what is your revenue profile. That's more important than actually correctly forecasting your revenue, because you probably are right now in a phase where you don't have a ton of revenue. So how do you actually do this? So you use Excel or Google Sheets. I don't really want to get into like, oh, I prefer Excel. I do. I see someone using a Microsoft Surface in the audience, which is the computer I use. So it was an employment condition for me. I told the founders of Brex that I would not come if they required me to use a Mac. But I do use Google Sheets as well. It's better for collaboration. So I think it depends on what's easier for you. The thing that I stress, and I've already mentioned, is that when you're trying to have an investor take a look at your business, don't share a Google Sheet with that person. That is amateur and stupid. Okay? You either send it in a PDF or you send an Excel. So, right, there's just a certain way that business is conducted when you're dealing with a contract or a negotiation, and it's typically not done through shareable, commentable documents, because you don't really want that, right? You're trying to send like, this is my final projection, not like I'm sharing with you some thoughts on how my business might work. So there is a place still for the Microsoft Office suite in today's world. Okay, so you're going to do that, and what we've talked about, and then you're going to make 5 to 10 key assumptions. One, and most important, hiring, because we're trying to get burn. Top line volume or marketing ROI. What I mean here, because now we're talking about projections. So you can forecast two ways. You can either say volume's going to come and I'm going to have to pay for it, or I'm going to pay for it and the volume will come. There's not really a right answer when you don't know what you're doing, right? And let me be more clear. So you can, a simple example, I could advertise on the Super Bowl. I'm going to spend $5 million, and I'm just going to guess at what comes in from that. And that's my volume. So I'm sort of starting with how much I spend on marketing and assuming a conversion of that marketing. Or I'm assuming a bottoms-up customer growth, and I'm guessing at what the cost of that marketing is. It may be that it's all word-of-mouth referral, in which case there is no cost. And you're just guessing at how many people you can refer, and then how many people they refer, or something like that. Or you say, like, actually, I'm advertising on Facebook, and I think it's going to cost this much to get this many page views. And then of those page views, 1% are going to visit my sign-up page, and of those people, 10% are actually going to sign up. And so that's the cost there. So it just, you got to do one or the other if you want to come up with how you're going to acquire customers. Churn. So that kind of churn, as I already talked about. Realistically, how many people are going to leave your product every month? It's nobody. Well, some people may have a zero churn, but I've never seen that business. If you have that, let's talk. But the point is also that some people actually have negative churn. We have that at Brex. So there are people that leave Brex. But back to the Twilio example, the customers that use Brex are the ones that grow so much faster. AWS probably has this same thing in their business. That's why they give credits to people, because the companies that work spend so much more on AWS than the companies that don't, that they actually probably have negative churn. Everybody loves AWS, right? That's one of the reasons. That's why I was sure. So I think that's something to consider. And then pricing. Right, so some people hold firm on pricing really well, and they say, like, we don't discount, right? And a lot of times that's not really. If you have a sales force, like, good luck with that. But the point, so you need to be realistic about what's the pricing mix, and so these are the kind of assumptions that you need to make as you're making these projections. So I do want to draw one distinction. There's kind of two things we're talking about. You're forecasting your business from a burn perspective. That's so you know when to fundraise and how much to fundraise. And then you're forecasting your business from an investor perspective, and that's when you're getting into more of this, right? So you're doing both. You have one model, right? How is my company going to do? But it serves two purposes. You may not necessarily need to share with an investor every single person's salary and what, the burn that you expect. But you really should be working from one set of financials. What you choose to share is different. Is that clear? Okay. Setting valuation and milestone fundraising. So this is hard, right? Because it's kind of like, well, what are you, in today's world, when you're raising money, you should have a sense for what your milestones and goals are, and also what you want your money, like how much you're raising and what's your valuation. So it's always a bit of a trick but it's not as tricky as it sounds, I guess, because we've talked about you have your resources needed to attain these milestones, and you have this sort of cash burn. You never want to go below 6 months. By the way, this is just like my home brewed, this is what's worked for me. So you don't have to follow this, but you're here, so I assume you want to know what I think. You have that buffer, as I've talked about, and that actually gets you to a valuation, right? So you say, like, I need $1 million. Let's say that's what I need to have comfortably 6 months of runway for my next round. Okay, if I need $1 million, I'm kind of raising at a $5 million pre, right? It's kind of true in today's market that investors who are leading around typically want to have either the new money in or their own stake at roughly a 20% ownership. It's not always that way, but it's not going to be significantly different from that. So because of that, that's a good way to estimate what you're raising at, because some people want to know. Like, it may be in the discussions that you have with investors, they just come to you with the valuation and they say, like, this is what you're worth, but typically this is kind of the math that people are doing, because you're always trying to give up as little as possible, so you're raising with that buffer. But the reality is it's pretty hard, once you're Stripe and you say, like, okay, we want to raise $250 million and give away a little bit of the company, sure. But in the beginning, people kind of want 20% because they want to feel like they have a real ownership in your company. The other thing is, and I mentioned this market comparable thing, it's true of KPIs and it's also true of a sanity check, right? If you think your business, if you're competing with, and this was a little bit the WeWork problem, right? They were competing with a business that is valued at Y and they have the same market share and they're saying, well, we're 20 or we're 5Y. And so you want to think through that as you start to set your valuation. Like, we look at ourselves and we look at American Express. American Express is a $100 billion company. So one of the things we're always saying when we're doing our financials is like, well, what are we saying in 5 years? How much volume are we saying we're doing, and how much is that relative to American Express? Because if we're saying we're more than American Express in 5 years, that seems dumb. If we're saying that we're only 1/100th of American Express, but we're worth half of American Express, that also kind of seems dumb. So you want to think, obviously in the earliest stages, you've got other problems, but it's just helpful to see, because you're trying to think for, like, how big could my business be and how is it going to be considered in the market? And so those are all the kind of questions you want to be asking yourself. And then you want to manage investor expectations. So you want to set out a process. I haven't been as good at this as I'm sort of making it sound, because often it depends on your business and your relationships with investors, but sometimes, you're kind of have a dialogue and then it spins. But the best way to do things is to basically establish a process.Maybe your process is you're just talking to some people that you know really well, and if they're interested, you're ready to go with them. Maybe you like a big fancy, I'm going to fly to New York and meet with all these people. I'm going to, go to Sand Hill Road, and depends on what you do. There's no right answer, but know your process in advance and have your outputs ready. So that's typically a presentation that goes through your business. What are you trying to do? What's the market? Who you are? An investor model, we already talked about it. And then some supporting schedules. So supporting schedules are things that compare you to the market. Supporting schedules are oftentimes your marketing costs and why it will go down over time and what gets you to there, or where what source of information. One other thing would be, I don't know if I have a slide on unit economics. No. So unit economics is another thing that, just to cover unit economics for 1 minute. Unit economics are what is the profitability of delivering 1 unit of your product. And the reason you talk about that is, as you build and scale, you're typically investing for the future, so you've got a lot more overhead than you need to deliver just 1 product. You're not a mature company. So people could see your financials and be like, wow, you're burning so much money, you lose so much money, why would I invest in this? And it's like, no, because now that I'm building all this software today, but if you look at just the profitability of 1 customer, I bring on one customer, it costs me, let's say I have a $10 a user a month revenue model, so I'm making $120 a year, but it only costs me $10 of Facebook marketing to bring this person on, and the cost to deliver is nothing. So now I basically make $110 a year, even though if you look at my financials, because I have all these software engineering and I'm paying for all this other stuff that's about growth, but you're just looking at delivering one unit. I've talked about market model and comparables a lot, but it's just, I really stress it because I think it doesn't come naturally to people that are focused on building a company, which is just think about the other unless you are doing nuclear fission, you probably have something that looks similar to what you've done before, and you should look at that and consider it, and what the economics of that look like. And is your pricing in line with what other people are charging? If you're offering a consumer subscription service, what does it cost to buy Netflix and Spotify? It's kind of relevant, right? What are consumers paying for things today? So there's all different metrics. If you're offering a B2B service that does X, Y, or Z, what are other people paying for that, right? And there's just certain things, and so pricing, profits, all these things are things I would really encourage you to look through what's out there in the market. And then market model also can mean if you're in a really competitive market that has established players, that's just getting to the question of market share, right? So if you were trying to come up with a competitor to AWS and Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure, bless your heart, you could see the market, right? So if you wanted to model the market, you'd say this is the number of companies in the country. This is the market share of all these businesses. All that's public. And where do I fit in? Is the market just growing so much that I'm capturing net new? Am I taking share from AWS and Google Cloud and Azure? You got to think through all that depending on how established your market is, right? If you're a consumer product and you're competing with a shampoo, right? So what am I taking share from, and does that overall market grow? Because at some point, you are going to approach the bounds of that market, right? If you are growing, all of you want to grow fast, the US economy grows at 3% GDP. Well, depends, maybe it's 2. So if GDP is growing at 2%, why are you growing at 150,000%? Right? Is it because you're taking market share? Is your market so new? Just know where you are in the broader market, because that's how investors consider you. So that's all I have. Oh wait, am I going the wrong way? Yeah. That's all I have, but I can go back to any other slides if they're more helpful in the broader context, or I can answer questions or not. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. I'm wondering if you could share with us how Brex thought about equity versus cash compensation for early employees and how that's evolved over time, and how that also compares to if you've analyzed other companies how they structure their equity compensation.
Yeah. So I think we're not as traditional in this way. So I'll just talk about what we do. I think the one thing. So what you don't want to do, you want to pay people how they want to be paid, right? So what we found is that sometimes, especially among engineers, as you're recruiting technical talent outside of the founding team, everybody's telling them they're the next thing, right? Everyone's like, this company's going to be huge, and no one's saying oh, this company's shit, come join, right? So the point is that a lot of times people are not really bought in to the equity story, and you want them to be, but don't pay them the way you want them to be paid. Pay somebody the way they want to be paid. So we had people, and it kind of sucks for them, who didn't take a lot of equity up front. They were like, I just want cash. And it's like, okay, why don't you go work at Google? I don't know. But the point is that they did come and they didn't take a lot of equity. So we always took the approach, which is pay people. Don't assume people necessarily are coming to a startup to get a lot of cash. They'll get a lot of equity. Sometimes people are coming because they really like the product, or they just want to work at a startup, or they're whatever. So that's kind of one lesson. I think to be more specific on how we thought about it, look, there's all these databases that tell you what the market is. So they'll tell you for an engineering manager, this is what they get paid in terms of what is the benchmark. So those are usually readily available. So you can kind of get a sense for, and if you're using recruiting firms, which is kind of the market, they'll tell you kind of where you need to be. But I think that the advice I can say is to just don't presume that don't force people into your own version of comp or how you want it to work. I think you can make it more about how they want to be, because if you believe in your own company, as long as you have the cash to pay, because the reality of Silicon Valley is that there's not a lot of people who are going to come outside of the founding team that are going to like take a huge lifestyle adjustment to come. We didn't see a lot of that. I think on the business side, non-technical, you do see a little bit more of that. How it's evolved has been that we let people, one of the things we did that was a little bit different is we always let people choose their mix of cash and stock. So I guess a way to implement what I'm saying is to just tell people what their total comp is and then let them decide between cash and stock how they want that mix. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a follow-up question, were you worried at all about like sort of misalignment of incentives for people who really want a lot of cash versus not a lot of equity, especially in the early days?
I was worried about that. I mean, look, you never know what people's situation is. So I think that if someone's like, I don't want any equity, it's kind of like, okay. But I think that there's going to be people, yeah, I mean, you do want people aligned. And I think that I wouldn't ignore the sign. So if there's other things, if you're kind of like questionable on the hire and the person's like, oh, I don't want any equity, that will tell you something. But there are definitely situations where you don't know what someone's own situation is. And there's people who have gone to 3 different startups before and none of them have worked. And they're tired of the equity story. And they're now ready to buy a house or they have a kid. So you don't always know, I guess is what I'd say. So you got to consider the context of the person as well.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi. This is Shankar here. In a pre-seed company, how do you deal with part-time founders? Like, do you set the targets, or how do you distribute the equity, and how is the play done?
So part-time. So I'm not a huge believer in the concept of a part-time founder, because I think that. So I tried to be a part-time, not a founder, but I tried to be an advisor to Brex in the beginning when I was at SoFi. I was like, oh, I'll just be an advisor. Because I wanted to see if it was going to work, right? And they said, no, that's not going to work. You either come or you don't. So in general, I think it's hard to do something part-time, but it may be, I would consider that more of an advisor. And so maybe, but I'm not trying to cause any issues. But I think that what I would probably, I guess a mathematical way to do it would be to say, well, what percentage of the 40-hour work week is that person spending? So between Monday at 9 a.m. and Friday at 5 p.m., what percentage of that time is this person spending? Because like anyone's going to tell you, everybody works weekend, right? So between that time, divide that into 40, the number of hours, and then multiply that by, or take that fraction and whatever you would give a full-time founder, do that.
So you mentioned market modeling and like trying to project your potential market based on growth of a market versus going into a market where there's already a strong player and taking market share from them. So like we're entering a market with a 30-year established $6 billion player.
Okay.
And yeah, how would we calculate our potential market based on the fact that we have no real evidence that market is growing necessarily?
Right.
But we also have a lot of evidence that the established player is sort of prime for disruption.
Totally. Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with going into a market that has a lot of established players and itself is not fast growing. Actually, Google and Facebook did that, right? So advertising doesn't outgrow the US economy. It's just that there's been a huge shift in advertising from print and outdoor and other, radio, TV to online, right? So the overall spend on advertising has not grown significantly, right? Because advertising is a huge piece of GDP, but so there's nothing wrong with what you're saying. The point is that, I mean, there's lots of other businesses that have done that. I guess the point is if you invested in something like, so that's very common, and what all you would need to do is talk about, I mean, that said, at a Broadway, you could argue like, okay, the internet has grown tremendously, which is true, but the actual revenue model of Google is advertising, and that has taken share from other entities. And so I don't think that there's anything scary about entering a market that itself has an established player and isn't growing. You just have to understand how much share can you take from that person. Right, but to assume that could ever be bigger than 6 billion that's where you kind of question. So if you're showing a projection that you're bigger than the established player in 5 years, you want to understand why that is. Maybe it's new products, maybe it's because, you're charging more because you're offering more value, but you got to just make sure you know the answer.
Is there any rule of thumb, like how to project how much market share you could take from them?
So anything over 20 is high, right? I mean, AWS is 50% market share, market leader. Really, I don't know if that's still true, but it's roughly true, I think, which is really good. And that's like they created this market. Everybody's racing to catch up to AWS because AWS kind of was the first person to offer this, cloud computing and storage online. So it depends on the market dynamic, but if there's an established market, like in consumer products, shampoo, something like that, like 20% market share would be incredible.
So in an early stage, pre-seed, prior to product market fit, is it a good idea to compare?
But I've been there.
Yep. Is it okay to compare the other competitors if you're addressing a different serviceable market with a different customer segment? The technology's been established, but you're going after a completely different customer segment.
Yeah, I think the main lesson I'm trying to offer is that don't do this because it will really help you set price. It will help you think through how your business can grow. There's no specific rule, just consider what those other people are doing and how they've done, right? So the point is like when we were doing Brex, we were not doing exactly what Silicon Valley Bank is doing, right? Silicon Valley Bank is very different, but so we kind of knew, well, how many customers does Silicon Valley Bank have? And how many people use their credit card? Our credit card is bigger than Silicon Valley Bank's credit card at this point in 2 years. But the point was when we were telling investors how big could Brex be, we were like, well, one thing to note is Silicon Valley Bank's credit card, which is like not that good, is only this, it's this big. So it's just more helpful to know than it is, there's no one prescription. It's just look at the information that's available to make sure and validate that what you're doing is reasonable.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing earlier. And my question revolves around for a founding team. I think you mentioned several times that a lot of the founders, they might not have the time or the expertise to really look into the finance side of things.
Yes.
So at what point in a company's kind of growth trajectory you think it's a good time to kind of have like a full-time person to jump on? And before that actually happens, how could a funding team kind of deal with these kind of strategy? Like what do we do with the, maybe the cash we have, or like how do we do projection, things of that sort?
Sure. So I think you should have some sort of outsourced accountant pretty early in the company that's looking at the financials. If one of you has some expertise in this space and wants to take this on, obviously I recommend that. I think Series A is probably where I would bring on a person who's at least operational, and even if they're working with the outside accountant, they're kind of managing that relationship. And then Series B is where I'd probably bring on like a CFO, VP of Finance type person.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I would like to ask, why did you jump in this new adventure, and why did you believe in Brex? I mean, you also say that it's not good to be like a part-time worker into a new startup.
Yeah,
so
I say a lot of opinions. I know it's bad, but
Yeah,
I'm
so
here
I-
to give my opinion.
I assume that you've been full-time workers since the beginning for Brex, but why did you jump into this new adventure?
Sure. So that was because Well, I mean, it's a little bit personal, which is fine. But this is my story, which is that when I went to SoFi, I was just hoping that I would learn something about. I always wanted to, be on the early team. My father was CFO. He took a company public that he joined in South Boston really early, so I kind of grew up with this stuff. I was more of a risk taker as a person. I mean, not as risk taking as some of you because you're, founding companies. I went to join a company that had already raised money. So there's a whole spectrum of risk takers. But for people of my background who've worked at JP Morgan and, I was crazy for doing this. But I think that I just kind of, because I had managed the corporate card business at Brex, I knew that we were competing with banks on software, which is not an area that banks tend to shine, and it was not on price. And so I really, no one's really selecting a credit card because of, as you get bigger, you're really worried about how it integrates with your accounting and all the stuff that we do at Brex, not so much like the rewards and stuff, which is a version of price. So I just knew it would work. I mean, I didn't know, but I suspected strongly. And I was looking for that kind of a risk. Okay, last question.
So one of the things that we've learned from extensive interviews and product testing is we're marketing to SMBs, but their customers are who we're doing the testing with, and we're getting an 84% conversion rate. They want us. They want their companies to have our product. What kind of sales conversation helps you leverage that? Who are the kinds of people that you would look for in the financial context of it is hey, you're going to make significantly more revenue that allows you to maybe grow out of this SMB bubble and become somebody bigger.
So you're saying that you want to know what to tell the potential customers of your product based on the conversion that you're seeing?
Or not just that, really, you were there at the early days of Brex when the first customers mattered more. What did this, successful sales processes look like? Who did you find?
I did it, right? So I sold a lot of our first stuff. I did a lot of the I'm a CFO and I know kind of what you need. And so I think that typically the early team is doing a lot of the sales. I'm not necessarily a salesperson, but I'm not the ugliest and the stupidest person you'll find. I'm not saying I'm the most handsome or smartest, but I think that I was reasonable enough to have a conversation, and I kind of knew, I at least understood our customer, what they were looking for. So I think it's normal that just like there's an operational founder, one of the founders or someone, if you're the only founder, you got to do it. But you just sort of have that conversation, and I think using data, sales just use your head. So I think you sound like you're off to the right start.
So were there KPIs that customer had X, it tended to be successful?
Yeah, I think that we would this is very specific to Brex, but one of the things we found, and this is part of, now we're sort of talking about product market fit, which is fine. We were okay, one of the things that's really helpful is international founders. People that are not from the US, that don't have US credit, need our credit card more. So as we sort of realized what was working, too many waters, as we realized what was working and what wasn't working, we doubled down on what was. So I think that's part of the iterative process.
Thank you.
No problem. Well, thank you all for your time tonight. I appreciate it.